Hello, welcome to Lesson 4 of Human Rights International. Today we'll be talking about implicit bias, institutional racism, and the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I hope you enjoy the lesson. Before we start today's lesson, I'm going to suggest you check your privilege, and you can check your privilege in two ways. You can fill out the form here on this slide, or you can do a virtual privilege walk. Now, when we talk about checking your privilege, the assumption when you check your privilege is that our societies are geared to favour people of certain cultural, economic and social backgrounds. When you check your privilege, you find out whether you are privileged by these implicit biases in society or whether you are not. So you can use this document here to check your privilege and see what you find out. The other way to check your privilege is to do the virtual privilege walk. Now, privilege walk is usually when you line people up in a line and you ask certain questions of them. And if they answer yes, they take a step forward. And if they answer no, they take a step back. So one of the questions in this privilege walk is, did your parents go to university? If you answer yes, it means you take a step forward and you are pretty much favoured by society. If you answer no, you take a step back, which means it's going to be harder for you to progress within society. As I said, there's an underlying assumption in these activities that our Australian Western society is biased towards people of certain economic, social and cultural backgrounds. Now, a lot of these privilege walks and privilege documents are based on American tropes, so don't get too attached to it. It's just an indication, okay? So I hope by doing the privilege exercises, it's been able to give you an idea of how our society is structured. Now, your position in society under these theories will contribute towards you having an implicit bias. Okay? Now, implicit bias is a bias that occurs automatically without conscious knowledge or control. What it means is that if you're a woman and you see a really big bloke on the street who's walking too close to you, you might think this man is a threat to you. And that's an implicit bias. It's an instinctive thing that you really don't have any control over. There are different types of implicit bias. One form of implicit bias is racial bias. It's based on stereotypes of people that you grow up with. One of those stereotypes might be that all Irish people drink a lot. So when you meet an Irish person, you might automatically assume that they want to go down to the pub and have a drink, which isn't necessarily true. But the way you've been brought up, the information that you've been given as a child, the movies you've seen, the books you've read, they give you this idea, this stereotypical idea that you don't even realise you have, and you act on that instinctively. Okay, so there are different types of implicit bias, as I said. Now, the TED talk that I've linked here is about, in particular, racial bias and implicit racial bias, and it's really good, and I recommend you have a look at that. So, like I said, there are different types of implicit bias. There's gender bias, racial bias, class bias, bias based on sexual preference, and bias based on people's abilities or disabilities. Okay, so there might be an assumption when you see someone in a wheelchair that they're not able to do different things, and that assumption could be completely wrong. So it's a lot about how the environment around you affects the way you think, and you don't even realize it. And it affects your behavior in certain ways. It affects how you act towards people who are different. One of the effects of implicit bias is that because individuals, and we all have implicit bias, as groups of individuals, we create institutions that carry that bias with them. Institutional bias is bias that is entrenched in bureaucracies and institutions like government, schools, and hospitals. So in the TED Talk, Melanie talks about how she was in hospital with her husband. They're an African American family, and the doctors in the hospital, the white doctors in the hospital, assumed that because her husband was an African American man of a certain age, that his illness was due to drug abuse or homosexual activity. So they assumed he had HIV, and they were wrong. But they were so wedded to this bias, to this idea that African Americans of a certain age, most of them, they just had this idea that most of them suffered. This would be the most common illness amongst African American men of this particular age, that they didn't even bother looking at other illnesses. And it wasn't until she called them out on that that they found the cause of his illness. So this is an institutional bias. Now, a really good example talking about institutional bias is an article by Shirley Bryce Heath, and I've attached it in the Moodle. Basically, Shirley Bryce Heath wrote this article in the 1980s, and she found that schools in a certain part of America favoured children who behaved in a way that was more common in European households. So, for example, she suggests that African American children grow up with a culture of oral transmission of knowledge, and that schools favour written transmission of knowledge, so that when African American children get to schools, they are automatically disadvantaged because their way of transmitting knowledge is through oral behaviours, through talking and acting things out. And the school frowned on that sort of behaviour. The school emphasised written knowledge, reading, writing. So that was an institutional bias in schools. It's a really good article, and I recommend you have a look at it. Now, I've included this idea of institutional bias at universities, mainly because it's something I experienced myself when I went to university, and it may not be as prevalent now. But I came from a family that grew up with the Daily Telegraph and Channel 9 and, mainstream culture. We didn't watch the ABC, didn't read the Sydney Morning Herald. And I found that at the university, when I was in a lecture, the lecturer would refer to the news from the Sydney Morning Herald or a show on the ABC, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And it was a class bias, right? Because I came from a working class family. Neither of my parents went to university. And I just wasn't brought up with these sorts of media input. So I didn't understand these references. So there's a class bias, I think, at university. There's also a bias, a cultural bias, obviously, when you're at a Western university. And you can actually, there's a whole assumption that people understand Western cultural references at a university. And some people who don't come from a Western cultural background may not understand those references and may be in the same position that I was in as well. So this is particularly relevant for people, for you guys, because if you're going to universities, you might find that you find these same problems and just realise that it's part of the bias in the institution, that the institution has this bias within it. Okay, universities make assumptions that you can do things and you may not always be able to do them or understand them. So you have to recognise that, and if you want to be successful at a university, you sort of have to adapt to that cultural bias. Ideally, you would challenge the cultural bias, but it's very hard to change an institutional bias, particularly if you're only one person. One of the ways to combat institutional bias is through the legal system, and a lot of the law regarding racial discrimination comes from the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is the UN document which has been signed by many nations around the world. It was adopted in 1965 by the United Nations, and it talks about explicit racial discrimination and implicit racial bias, structural bias. In part, it says that superiority based on racial difference is scientifically false, morally condemnable, socially unjust, and dangerous. It also says there is no justification for racial discrimination in theory or practice anywhere. And it says that states agree to criminalise acts of violence or acts of inciting violence against any race or group of persons of another colour or ethnic origin. So the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination was adopted by the UN in 1965, but Australia didn't sign it until 1975. And can you guess the reason for that? Perhaps you can. It's the White Australia policy. Australia had a White Australia policy as a legal part of our legal system until the 1970s. So we couldn't really sign a document against racial discrimination when our immigration policy was discriminatory. Australia signed the convention in 1975, which was the same year that the Racial Discrimination Act was brought in Australia. So the two actions were probably related. Now, a state can commit to a convention and can commit to incorporating the rights in that convention into their state legislation, but they can have reservations about certain parts of the convention. So in the case of the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the United States does not accept any part of the convention that limits speech, including hate speech. And Australia still does not accept Part 4A, which is about hate speech. So Part 4A is, it shall be an offence punishable by law or dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or hatred, incitement to racial discrimination, as well as all acts of violence or incitement to such acts against any race or group of persons of another colour or ethnic origin, and also the provision of any assistance to racist activities, including the financing thereof. Now, in the Racial Discrimination Act, we have anti-vilification laws, which means that it is an offence to incite violence based on race. However, it could possibly be argued that political parties like One Nation are racist and promote racist activities, and One Nation gets financing from the government because they win votes. Of course, the United States would also have a reservation about this part of the convention because the United States clings to the idea that free speech includes hate speech. And we can see where that has got the United States. So basically, this is a fairly complex topic, but it's something that you encounter every day. You might encounter structural and institutional bias against you because you're female, because you have a disability, because of your gender identity, because of your sexual preference, because of your cultural background. Many people in this country encounter institutional bias every day. So for your homework, and it might be a little bit difficult, can you think of an institution that shows structural bias in Australia or around the world? What sort of bias? Can you give an example of the bias? Just one paragraph. Have a think about it. If you can't do it, that's fine. Do the privilege walk and see how you go with that. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture.